But then it's a huge pleasure to welcome everybody today. As I'm sure you all know, this year, 2025, is the 800th anniversary of the reissuing of Magna Carta in 1225. And so we thought it important to mark the anniversary by organising this conference. And during the course of the day, our speakers are going to be telling us why Magna Carta 1225 is perhaps the more important anniversary, and then during the rest of the day exploring some of the implications that flowed from Magna Carta over the decades and centuries that followed. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome Professor David Carpenter, Professor of Medieval History at King's College, London, and I'm sure needs very little introduction, as you're already familiar with his publications on Magna Carta, other aspects of 13th century history, and his indispensable volumes, the biography of Henry III. So it's a great honour to welcome you, David. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. And as usual, it's wonderful to be back talking to this illustrious and erudite society. So yes, this year, 2025, is indeed the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. It's the 800th anniversary of the, of the charter you see here. And what is it? It's a charter issued by King Henry III at Westminster on the 11th of February, 1225. So 800 years ago this year. Three other originals of the 1225 issue, 1225 Magna Carta, survive. This one's at Durham, beautifully preserved, apart from the fact that in the 18th century an archivist spilt ink all over it. As you can see, I'm glad to say we have some people from the National Archives here today, and I'm sure nothing like that would have happened or would happen today in anything in their custody. And as you can see, it's authenticated with the King's seal at the bottom, a beautiful Henry III seal. So I'm sure none of you here would ever say Magna Carta was signed. It was sealed. So why is this document so famous? Why is it perhaps the most famous document in world constitutional history? I think there are various reasons for that. The first is that it does assert a fundamental principle that the ruler is subject to the law, that he can't just say, off with your head, into prison, I'm seizing your property. If he wants to act against you, he has to do so by due legal process. He, or to quote the most famous chapter, or became the most famous chapter, he has to do so either by judgment of your peers or by the law of the land. So Magna Carta asserts that fundamental principle. But I think we need to go beyond that, because it doesn't just assert that principle in a series of high-flown sentiments. What it does is to regulate in great detail the whole running of royal government. And as you can see, it's a very long document. It's 3,000 words of Latin. And when contemporaries copied it out, they conventionally divided it up into a whole series of separate chapters. We'll see an image of that later on, and they often used to sort of write in the margins what each chapter was about. And if you analyze it, you see that the whole range of royal government is regulated in a series of do's and don'ts. So finance, justice, local administration, relations with the church, running of the royal forest, and so on. So it's that nitty-gritty of the charter which gave it purchase in its own time, and which meant that people were so interested in it. And I think one third thing about it is very important to grasp. It's sometimes said it was just a selfish baronial document. Now, that's true, but it's also false. It's false because I'll say briefly, it reaches out to a constituency much broader than just the great barons. How is it true? It's true in the sense that many of the major chapters, especially early on, deal with the grievances of the barons. It's also true in the sense that the unfree didn't benefit nominally, at any rate, from its provisions. The Charter is granted simply to people who are free. Now, in this illustrious audience, of course, you can all be lords and ladies. But if we were to put you back and make you a cross-section of early 13th society, I'm sorry to say that perhaps half of you might well be unfree. You would be unfree peasants, and perhaps we can make Philip, myself, Andrew, and the other speakers lords and knights, and you would be working for us as peasants on our manors, and we would have the perfect right to increase your labour services, raise your rents, or eject you from your land, just as we wished. You had no legal redress at all to us. So that's another major qualification. But it is still true that the Charter reaches out to a much broader constituency than just the barons. There's an important chapter on London and the towns. The first chapter is on the church. The whole running of local government was placed to some considerable extent in the hands of knights, so a level below the great barons. And I think that the reform of local government would benefited wide sections of society, or potentially did so, even down to those people who were unfree. So if it hadn't been for this broad reach of the Charter, I don't think it would ever have survived. So that is the Charter of 1225. I'm sorry to go on. Of course, it has survived down the ages. And indeed, I had an illustration of that only this year when I discovered a new original of Magna Carta in the library of Harvard Law School. And it went viral in America because it seemed amazingly providential that Harvard Law School, under attack from the then President of the United States, should have this iconic document asserting the rule of law. And when I was out there to celebrate the finding, the chief librarian said to me that at one point she had simply read out to her assembled staff a passage from my book on Magna Carta to the effect that it was indeed a barrier to a tyrannical ruler, read out this passage and then said, I leave you to draw your own conclusions from that. Anyway, I got so far, and I've asserted that this is the, this year's the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. But if this wasn't a very learned audience, I'm sure many of you would be scratching your heads at this moment and saying, but how is that the case? Because surely the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta was celebrated 10 years ago in 2015. And we celebrated then the 800th anniversary of this document, which I'm showing you in a wonderful 1731 engraving, made all the more marketable because the engraver put the coat of arms of the 1215 Magna Carta barons alongside it. So this is the document, of course, this is the charter which King John issued at Runnymede on the 15th of June, 1215. And we go on. There is my first meeting with King John in my children's history of England. Our Island Story, it was called, with wonderful illustrations. And there is John at Runnymede. And I suppose this is the Archbishop Stephen Langton, of whom I'll say a little bit more later. And I'm pleased to see, this obviously is the charter, that he is going to seal it, isn't it? Or anyway, there seems to be a stamp there. I can't see any pen and ink. So yes, in the popular mind, this surely is Magna Carta, and indeed it is true that in 2015, on the 15th of June, all the great and good of the land gathered at Runnymede to celebrate it. The late King and the Duke of Edinburgh, the then Prime Minister David Cameron, what a long time ago that seems. Here is a view of Runnymede in lovely early 19th century painting, and you can see Windsor Castle in the background here. Here's obviously the Thames, and here is the wood above, and here's Runnymede running on down there. Indeed, I have good reason to remember the 800th anniversary, so-called, back on the 15th of June, 2015, because I had a near brush with death there, because as a Magna Carta pundit, I did receive invitation to meet the Queen. But unfortunately, there were all these security forms you had to fill in, and I didn't fill them in time. So when I did fill them in, I was told, too late. So what I thought was, well, actually, I'll make my way there as a humble member of the public, because the way it was arranged is that this bit was sort of public, and then there was a sort of rope and security barrier there, and then it was down here that the bands were playing, and the King and the Queen, the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh and co. were. So, but anyone could go to this bit. So what I did was, because I know Runnymede quite well, I walked up here into this woodland, and then came out of the woodland, and you then go on to the next image, and this is what I saw. So I came out here, and here, this is where all the bands were playing. You can just see the river there. But on the verge there were two police marksmen. And as I emerged from the wood, they swung towards me in menacing fashion, pointed their guns at me, and of course I thought my last hour had come. And of course, if it had, it would have probably all been hushed up, wouldn't it? My body would be found floating down the Thames a few days later. Mystery death of London academic. But fortunately, as I advanced towards them, I was quite smartly dressed, although I was also carrying a case, which they might have thought. I was able to calm them down, and I mustn't go on about my near brushes with death. I had another one at the castle of the Duchess of Gloucester once, and the policeman, after he had spared me, said, "Lucky it wasn't my colleague, sir. He's rather trigger happy." But anyway, they allowed me in the end to go on down, and indeed, we got an image here of me afterwards with some of you will recognise some Magna Carta pundits. There's me, there's Professor Vincent, Nigel Saul, Sophie Ambler. And I'm afraid, through no fault of mine, Nigel Saul's wife Jane has been cut off there. Anyway, so I did live to tell the tale. So anyway, Magna Carta was celebrated then, and this is it, 15th of June, 2015. So what on earth is this talk all about? What are we talking about? Well, the answer to it is very straightforward, which is that in the medieval period and long afterwards, this charter, the Charter of 1215, was never regarded as Magna Carta. It was called the Charter of Runnymede, the Charter of Runnymede. It's this charter which was universally called Magna Carta. So that brings me to perhaps not before time, to the theme of this talk. So I thought I'd look at three things very briefly. The first is, how do we get from the Charter of Runnymede here to Magna Carta? Oh, well, no, there's King John, we'll go back. How do we get from this charter to this one? That's the first thing. So how do we get from 1215, Charter of Runnymede, to Magna Carta in 1225? The second question is, were there any qualitative differences in this charter, the Charter of 1225, which made it much more likely to survive, to enter into the fundamentals of the polity than the Charter of 1215? And I certainly think there were. It was qualitatively a much more survivable document. And then finally, I'll look at how it was that the Charter of 1215 comes up on the rails, as it were, and in the end overtakes the Charter of 1225 and is now almost universally regarded as the Magna Carta, and the 1225 one has dropped into the background with some important qualifications, which we'll see. So let's first of all begin with the story of 1215 to 1225. And I know many of you will know this already, but obviously we begin with King John here on his tomb in Worcester Cathedral. And I think we need to think as to why he had issued the Charter of 1215, the Charter of Runnymede, in the first place. And the situation facing him was one in which he found it very difficult to see how he could win the war. Well over half, two-thirds of the great barons were in rebellion against him. They'd occupied London. John's position was very difficult to see the way forward. So what he thought was, look, if I concede this charter to these bastards, which is how he thought they were, they'll go home, they'll lay down their arms, there'll be peace, but they'll never get around to actually enforcing its poisonous terms. In other words, it'll become a vague symbol of good government and won't really make much difference to my real power. Now, John was a very clever political operator, but in this instance, he got it completely wrong. Because within a month or so, he began to see that the barons were going to be able to enforce the charter to the letter and beyond. And so he actually got the Pope within little more than a month to quash the charter. So as far as John's concerned, that's it. The charter has no more validity. And curiously enough, the barons, although I think they were deeply attached to the principles of the charter, sort of abandoned it too, because what they thought was, look, there's no way we can actually hold John's to its terms, and so we need to go down another route. And so what they did was to depose John and offer the throne to the eldest son of the King of France. And Louis comes to England in 1216, occupies London, carries all before him. Here is a wonderful charter he issued during the siege of Hertford Castle in 1216, and it's witnessed by a very large number of the greatest barons. It shows the huge support he has. So around this time in 1216, you might have thought the charter was a failure without a future. John had abandoned it, and Louis had no real brief for the charter. There's no evidence he ever confirmed it. He probably thought, or probably said, you don't need it with me as a benevolent Capetian king, it's going to be completely unnecessary. So what saved the charter? And incidentally, I think if Louis had won the war, or if John had won the war, Magna Carta might indeed, or the Charter of Runnymede might never have become Magna Carta. It would indeed have become a dead letter. But what transformed the situation was John's death in October 1216, with that great gale howling round Newark Castle. And he leaves his 9-year-old son, Henry III, in an absolutely dreadful situation, with probably over half, two-thirds of the great barons in rebellion against him. And so what the government, for the young king here, he is incidentally looking very anxious, being crowned a few years later by Archbishop Stephen Langton in this wonderful drawing by Matthew Paris. What his supporters realized, led by a papal legate, Guala, and led by the regent William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, was that the only way forward was to change tack completely. It was to concede what John had rejected and what Louis was ignoring, and issue a new version of Magna Carta. Sorry, I shouldn't say Magna Carta, it's the Charter of Runnymede, essentially they're issuing a new version of. And here it is, again at Durham, the only surviving original, and it's fundamentally the 1215 charter issued in the king's name, Henry's name now, but with some of its more radical provisions removed. And as you see, although the actual seals have gone, it was sealed by the papal legate Guala here. That would have been Guala's seal at the bottom, and William Marshall's there. Now, I think this had a profound effect on winning the war, because the decisive Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, Here's Matthew Paris's drawing of the Battle of Lincoln. The rebel barons did not fight very hard. They struck token blows and surrenders. There's huge lists of the barons who's surrendering. Not one was killed. Not one was killed. And the reason for that was that they knew their cause was won. They knew that the regency government of the young king had now completely reversed course and had accepted what the war had all been about in the first place, had accepted a new version of the Charter of Runnymede. Of course, also the disappearance of King John, who my friend and colleague John Gillingham once rightly described as a shit. His replacement by a young innocent boy, who we've seen, was a very important factor as well. So anyway, that their cause was run was confirmed at the end of the war in 1217, because the minority government then issued yet another version of the Charter of 1216 and ultimately the Charter of Runnymede. And here it is, probably from November 1217, this with the seals of the regent and the papal legate Guala and the regent William Marshall on it. And alongside it, triumph for the rebels, was this quite separate charter issued governing the running of the royal forest, the Forest Charter, which you see here. This time a bit more of the seal of the legate is attached to it. So from now onwards, the two charters always go together. The successor of the Charter of Runnymede and the Forest Charter. And it's only now in 1217, 1218 that the term Magna Carta is introduced, because the problem is now that the government in proclamations has to distinguish between, on the one hand, this charter, which is the successor of the Charter of 1215, and this charter, which is the charter governing the running of the royal forest. And there was one easy way to do it, and you can't really see it because they're both the same size on the screen, but this one, the successor of the 1215 charter, is physically ever so much bigger than the charter, we're going the wrong way, than the Forest Charter. And so, not very surprisingly, a clerk had the wheeze of using the term Magna Carta to describe this one, and all he meant by it was big charter, physically big. It didn't mean at all anything connected with its status. And here you see the very first appearance of the term in a proclamation or copy of a proclamation of 1218, precisely used to distinguish between the two. And amazingly, you'll see it's a scribal afterthought, isn't it? Little arrow, and here it is above the line. And when the clerk wrote that, he clearly had no idea at all that 800 years later it would have entered the sort of constitutional lexicon of the world. So now we have actually at last got to Magna Carta, and we've got to 1217, 1218. How do we get on to 1225? And the answer to that is not very difficult. It's in 1223-45, the King of France, who was now Louis, who had invaded England in 1216, was threatening to overrun the last remaining continental possessions of the dynasty. That's to say, Poitou and Gascony. And the government realized, still a minority government, though with the king playing a bigger part in it, he's now 1718, that the only way to save Gascony is to get a huge tax from the kingdom. And they equally realized that the only way to get a huge tax was to concede this version of what is now called Magna Carta in return for it. And so that brings me on to part two, which is, was the charter they now conceded qualitatively different from the Charter of 1215, and indeed from its predecessors in 1216, 1217? Is it much better equipped to survive? And I think there's no doubt that it was, which helps to explain, you see, that this is the final text of Magna Carta. All subsequent kings simply confirmed the Charter of 1225. So this is it. This is the final Magna Carta. And so I think that it's qualitatively different is really takes us back to Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And there he is on his seal. And at the other side of the seal shows the murder of Becket, like all seals of Archbishop of Canterbury on the back. And you can see the sword cutting off the top of Becket's head, and then the bit of the broken sword falling down there. And there's Becket's cap, and there's the top of his head, or rather grisly. Anyway, Langton was a great theologian. He was a practical man, but also his attachment to the Charter had a huge biblical background in biblical exegesis and so on. So he believed in it as a matter of principle rather than just a practical necessity. So I think he's the person who's responsible for some very important changes to the 1225 Charter, if we come back to it. Now, the first of those is to make the Charter more inclusive. Now, when I said the Charter was only granted to the free, I was actually cheating a little bit, because that's true of the Charter of 1215. But actually, the Charter of 1225 here has got a new preamble in which it says the liberties in the Charter are granted to everybody. Everybody. So that qualifies. The statement that it's only granted to the free is still there, but that's qualified by a new preamble up here. The second vital difference with this Charter is that it is more consensual. It is a consensual charter, part of a freely entered into bargain between the king and the kingdom. In other words, the idea that it's invalid because it's been extracted from the king by civil war and force, which you could obviously say of the 1215, but you could sort of say of 1216 and 1217, that's got rid of. And that was a very contemporary issue, because at a great council in 1223, one of the most rebarbative old ministers of King John, William Brewer, actually said at a council meeting, these charters are not valid because they've been extracted by force. And Archbishop Langton shoved him off into a corner and said, William, shut up. Do not disturb the peace of the kingdom by saying such things. Well, the 1225 Charter gave Langton the opportunity to place those kinds of objections to rest. So what is there which indicates that the Charter is now consensual? First of all, at the start, you can't obviously read it, the king says, Henry III is made to say, I've issued this of my own free and spontaneous will. And none of the previous charters had had that statement. Secondly, of course, it is now authenticated with the seal of the king, whereas he's now got a seal. The 1216 and 1217 charters had been authenticated just by the papal legate and the regent. Thirdly, perhaps more important than anything else, towards the end of the Charter, around here, it is stated explicitly that the concessions in the Charter have been given to the king in return for a tax granted him by everyone in the kingdom. So the Charter itself testifies to the fact that this is part of a freely entered into bargain. And there was one other thing in the Charter which showed that all the great and good of the land had now come together to agree it, and that is it has a huge witness list. Everyone important is clearly gathered at Westminster in February 1225, essentially at a parliament, to witness and approve it. And here is a wonderful copy of the witness list made at Kern. A copy made soon afterwards of the whole Charter in the clerkly of the Abbey of Cerne in Dorset. And the clerk clearly appreciated how very, very important witnesses was. And I should stress the previous charters had not had witness lists like that. There was no witness list to speak of at the end of John's 1215 charter, the 1216 or 1217 ones. But here everyone is there. So there's Stephen Langton at the top. Here are all the abbots. Here is Hubert de Burgh, the justiciar, and all the earls. And then, now I wonder whether we have a Mortimer here, Constable of Chester, Robert de Ross, Robert Fitzwater, Robert de Vipon, William Brewer, Montfichet, Peter Fitzherbert. Oh, if he's here, he's going to be some way down the list, isn't he? William de Albany, Arda Grelly. Oh, dear. John of Monmouth. Can we get there? See there. Peter de Morley. Have I missed him out? Well, sorry, let's go through again. Brewer, Montfichet, Peter Fitzherbert, Matthew Fitzherbert, Grelly. Oh, no, that's John of Monmouth, isn't it? Hugh de Mortimer. Well, you're spared. Okay, he's there. Some way down the list, I think. Don't you think? I mean, he's could be higher up. Anyway, sorry about that. There we go. At least he's above people like Peter de Morley. Was he above Peter de Morley? Because I mean, Peter de Morley is just a sort of foreigner. No, he is. He's above Peter de Morley. That's all right. Okay. So anyway, that witness list is hugely important, I think, in showing all the great and good land. And many of them are rebels in the Civil War. You see, rebels and loyalists have all come together. And they are all agreeing the Charter. And that allowed Langton to do one more thing, which is not in the Charter itself, but because it's now a consensual document, and no one can object any longer and say it's been coerced out of the king, he was able to support it with sentences of excommunication. He and his fellow bishops fulminated sentences of excommunication against everyone who broke the Charter. And they sort of stamped down their candles into the ground, having fulminated, and all the smoke goes up. And that was the beginning of two other great sentences of excommunication in support of the Charter, 1237, 53. And what it showed was that the church had now come a full square behind support of the Charter. And throughout the 13th century, the church, and of course they profit from the first chapter, safeguarding liberties of the church, the church is now absolutely behind the Charter, and probably it was the most committed advocate of the Charter throughout the 13th century. Hadn't been for the support of the church, sentence of excommunication, I don't think the Charter would have survived, or not survived, in nearly the same way. So, as I said, the Charter of 1225 then is just on a different level from all of its predecessors, and that explains how it does become final and definitive, and later kings confirm the Charter, confirm the Charter of 1225. They no longer issue new versions of it. So that brings me on, in conclusion, to my final thing. And I always remember my father in his sermons, he was a clergyman, would sometimes, because he frequently would take a sort of locum for our summer holidays, often for a month, 2 months, in which he swapped where he was for a parish church. And he loved being a parish vicar, and the job he had meant he wasn't a parish vicar anymore. So he loved coming. And one we took was at Church Stretton. And I remember getting off at Craven Arms, and that's how we got to know Ludlow very well. But of course, the downside of it was that for 4 weeks, indeed sometimes for 8 weeks in the summer, we had to go and listen to my father's sermons every Sunday, and we did become quite familiar with them. Anyway, one trick I remember. Oh, one thing I do remember is that he frequently towards the end would say, "and finally," and then would go on, "and what Bennisms in that word finally." So anyway, I'm to say the same to you. Finally, remember, what I'm going to very quickly look at is how and when the 1215 Charter comes up on the rails and overtakes the 1225 Charter and becomes now thought of, with some qualifications we'll see, as the Magna Carta. Now, it took a very, very long time for that to happen. As I said, later kings simply confirmed the 1225 Charter. And here's a very good picture of that. Here's this is a copy, early 14th century copy of Edward I's confirmation of the Charter, of his father's Charter of 1225. You see it says Magna Carta up there in the corner. Here's Edward I. And what you can't quite see there is it Henricus there. He says, I confer Henry my father. Here he sets out the whole of the 1225 Charter. Notice it's numbered and so on. Later kings confirmed the Charter of 1225. And the idea that Magna Carta's 1225 Charter goes on right into the 17th century. As many of you may know, after a fallow period in the 15th century, Magna Carta was revived by the lawyers of the late Tudor Stuart period and was once again brought out as a barrier, as they thought it, of the tyranny of the Stuart kings. The most important of all was Sir Edward Coke, as Sir John Baker has shown in various publications. But for Coke, the charter he's appealing to is the Charter of 1225. He hardly ever mentions the Charter. He doesn't mention King John at all. And of course, you remember Shakespeare's play, Shakespeare's King John, says nothing about Magna Carta. For Coke, 1215 was still, if it was anything, a Charter of Runnymede. Here, indeed, if you go on, you can see, this is actually after Cook's death, 1680, but observations, comments by Lord Justice Cooke, and what's he commenting on? Magna Carta made in the 9th year of King Henry III, so 1225, and then confirmed by Edward I, 28th year of his reign. That's the 1300 confirmation. That was the one I found, one of the few originals of the 1300 confirmation at Harvard. So how did all this change? Well, we go on into the next century and to another great lawyer, very solid-looking man, Judge Blackstone. Now, Blackstone was both a practicing lawyer, but also an academic lawyer. And he was the very, very first person to sort out all the various versions, additions, if you like, of the Charter from 1215 through to 1225, and then 1297, 1300. So for the very first time, he set out the text alongside, in one book, of 1215, 1216, 1217, 1225, 1297, Edward's confirmation, 1300, Edward's confirmation. So the first time the relationship between all of these various editions of the Charter was clear. And from the word go, he called the 1215 Charter. He had no truck with the Charter of Runnymede. He didn't mention it at all. From the word go, as you see here, he called the 1215 Charter the Magna Carta of King John. Now, I gave a talk on these lines to a school in Oxford, actually, 2 weeks ago, and a very interesting question. I'm sorry to steal the sort of question which no doubt is on the tips of the tongues of the audience here. So I'm sorry to forestall you, but one very good question for one of the pupil in the audience was, how did Blackstone justify doing this? And the answer is he doesn't at all. He doesn't indicate that he's for the first time calling King John's Charter Magna Carta. He doesn't mention the Charter of Runnymede. There's no explanation. But I think the explanation is implicit in the book, in that the book, by setting out all the various editions, is absolutely clear that 1225 is based on 1215. And perhaps I should have said that clearly, that in the medieval period, when actually the 1215 Charter was still copied a lot, it was quite clear to people in the 13th, 14th century that 1225 was based on 1215, but that didn't stop them thinking that 1225 was Magna Carta and 1215 the Charter of Runnymede. And I think that was possible too, because after all, Runnymede had been quashed by the Pope. It had no long-term validity, whereas 1225, as we've seen, had it was better in all sorts of ways, but it didn't seem to bother Blackstone. And so from now, he made King John's charter, calls it Magna Carta. And such was the authority of Blackstone that this simply sticks. Now, there's one qualification. The only area it has never stuck is actually in statute law, because what's on the statute book of the United Kingdom today, although nearly all the chapters have actually at some point been repealed, not because they were sort of denied, but because often they're overtaken by later legislation. What's on the statute book of the United Kingdom today are still chapters from the 1225 Charter, not 1215. And so if we go on to show the power of Magna Carta in 2015, in that year, as you can see, the government had this scheme to introduce court fees. If you wanted to bring civil litigation, you had to pay for it. And the Lord Chief Justice said, you can't do this against Magna Carta. And he was appealing to Chapter 29 of the 1225 Charter, still on the statute book, which said that justice should not be sold. Well, I'm pleased to say, as you can see, the ministers immediately prepared to retreat on court charges. So Magna Carta's power was shown. But apart from in the sort of statute law area, Blackstone's authority was such that both in popular culture and in academic writing, the Charter is now essentially thought of as the Charter of King John. And here we see it invoked in sort of popular culture in favour of votes for women. I'm never quite sure how that works. There's not a woman there, is it? But the barons seem to have taken up the cause. And clearly this is King John. It's not King Henry III. This is sort of King John. And similarly, in academic writing, here are my two battered copies of I think still the greatest book written on Magna Carta by the great historian J.C. Holt, Sir James Holt. And there's my battered copy of the 1965 edition. And here is my equally battered copy of the second edition, 1991, I think, 1992. A lot of people knew in advance that Holt was bringing out a new edition, and I did actually send him a little letter with indicating some of the mistakes he'd made prior to it. He didn't reply for ages until I got a little postcard through the post saying I had got the date of King John's death wrong in the minority of Henry III, which is only a misprint, but you know he was like that. He's sort of quite tough, looked like a sort of Magna Carta baron. There is now a third edition, which was brought out by two of his devoted pupils. He was but dead, alas, by then, in 2015. But I don't advise it because it has, apart from being not nearly as nicely set out typologically as second edition, it has a long preface criticizing my views. So I would, if I was you, I would stick to just the second edition. So the point is that this is a book essentially about King John and the Charter of 1215. There is a final chapter called the Reissues, which actually is wrong, as Susan Reynolds once pointed out to me, a great historian. They're not reissues, they're new versions, which were issued 1216, 1217, but it's sort of very much an afterthought. And here is my book on Magna Carta with the nice John Pine thing. And it's essentially, I suppose, it's about 1215, but I think it does give full weight and says some of the things I have said in this talk. So it does try and cover fully Magna Carta 1225 and the Charter in the 13th century and to some extent beyond. So where does this leave us? Philip said, I think at the start, that perhaps 1225 is more important than 1215. I think really we ought to hold the balance between them, in that clearly without 1215 there would have been no 1225, but without 1225 I don't think 1215 or any charter would ever have survived in the way it has. So I think we should hold the balance equal and celebrate both charters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Fascinating talk as ever. I'm sure enjoyed and appreciated by everyone. I loved your image from the children's history of England.
Oh, yeah.
I find that quite often when I'm sort of reading history books, I suddenly get an image in my mind from the Ladybird history books, and they must be images that are at least 55 years old. It's interesting how they stick in your mind, aren't they? I should just add, of course, that David's books and the books of our other speakers are available at the bookstall in the corner.
I should have gone on and showed you the image of the 2 volumes of Henry III, but you need to be need to be of strong stuff to look at those. But they are in paperback anyway. So there we go.
Are there any questions for David? People at home, for people at home, I'm now a disembodied voice, but I'm going to be roving around the auditorium with the microphone. So if there's anybody in the audience here with a question, I'll bring the microphone to you. And if people at home could put your questions in the chat, then we'll read out those questions. Are there any questions to David?
Well, while people are thinking, I've just got another image, nice image I can show you. So there's an interesting thing. There's just the list of the various editions. So 1215, 1216, 17, 1225, 1265, and then Edward III's confirmation. And here's a very nice image of a copy of the 1225 Charter. And it makes the point I said that individuals often had a table of contents at the start. They numbered all the chapters and everything. So you see Capitula, Magna Carta, the chapters of Magna Carta, they're all listed there. And then as you go along, you can see at the bottom, it is all numbered. It's lovely sort of gargoyles down the bottom, about which Michael Camille wrote, of course, so beautifully. So it's a lovely, lovely collection of legislation, beginning with Magna Carta there. And I'm sorry to go on with that, but talking about that, I think a key thing about all these copies is that it showed how the detail is really being taken to heart. In other words, again, Magna Carta is not just some sort of vague symbol. People are really very, very aware of its content and what's in it. Sorry, at this point I'll shut up. I saw my students for the first time yesterday, first year students, and I said to them, look, one thing AI can't do for you is actually talk in seminars and so on. So it's really important you talk. And I said the other vital thing is to shut me up, because otherwise I shall do all the talking. So, sorry, and you can see why I had to say that.
And of course, I having put the slides together for the presentations, I am aware, of course, that you have actually got some more slides as well, depending on questions that you're asked.
Following on from your final remark a couple of minutes ago, how appropriate is it to see in the Magna Carta, however defined, the solution to all our contemporary grievances?
Well, I wish that was true. I think it certainly is a very important principle that it asserts, which is the rule of law. And I think it should be an inspiration. I think at Harvard, they're thinking of putting their original on display there. And I think it will be an inspiration for future lawyers, to think about the importance of what they're doing. But certainly I don't think, alas, in terms of its detail any longer, it can be seen as a solution to all problems.
Thank you, David. As usual, a fantastic talk. In all of the medieval documents that are produced, they're produced by monks, etc., and they're written. How many different versions of the charters are there? In the sense of, are they identical when you have the 1225 that was written out 200 times or however many times it was written out. Are they identical?
Yeah, well,
You're the man who would know because you have the
this takes us
definitive
back to
answer.
the list here, the editions, and there are fundamentally 1225, 2/3 of it is probably the same as 1215, exactly the same phraseology, but between 1215, 16, 17, 1225, there are very important changes, a bit as I indicated for 1225. After that, the text being confirmed is just of 1225, though curiously enough, there were still changes, although it says it's 1225, 95% of it is, there are still changes made to the text without any indication, even in 1300. I think 1300 was which is the one Cook mentioned, was a very important confirmation because it's the last time the whole text was set out in 1225, and it's got two witness lists. It's got the 1225 witness list, and it's also got the 1300 witness list. So it's got two parliaments, if you like, having accepted it and confirmed it, and that's particularly what made 1300 the most authoritative and statute law and so on. So there are differences, yes, and that would be another talk to go into the detail of how they changed.
That was one of my questions. In terms of the differences between the 1215 and the 1225, what are the significant differences? And
Yeah.
would it be different the way society is governed today if the 2015 was enacted and carried through?
Yeah, well, I have cheated today because I've covered the good differences, and 1225 being more consensual and inclusive. For some of the people at the time, the bad difference was that the 1225 Charter has no constitutional means of enforcement in it, whereas 1215 did. 1215 had 25 barons set up who were empowered to force the king and his ministers to keep the Charter if they broke it. And that was the most revolutionary chapter in the 1215 Charter, and it was left out of all the subsequent chapters. And that indeed resonated a little bit when we had a discussion at Harvard, because, of course, one problem they're facing in America is what happens if the president decides to ignore rulings of the Supreme Court or ignore rulings on, well, at the highest level, if he ignores rulings of the Supreme Court. And there's not much then that actually can be done. So there seems to be a bit of a parallel between that and the charters after 1215. But of course, you know, it's like a bit like a nuclear option. Once you start to actually seize the king's lands and castles, because he's not obeying the charter, although you're legally allowed to do it in 1215, it basically just means a renewal of civil war. So it probably wasn't a very good way of trying to enforce the charter. But that was a problem all along. How do you enforce the charter when it's being broken? All kinds of means were thought of. Probably the best was the 1300 one, when knights were supposed to be set up in every county to hear complaints about the breaches of the charter, but that never seems really to have got off the ground. Or Andrew would know more about that than I do.
Yeah. To what extent do you think Henry III was personally involved in the decision to reissue the charter in 1225?
Yeah, I don't think he probably was very much. I mean, he's still 1718, very much under the influence of Archbishop Langton, but also of the Justiciar Hubert de Burgh. I mean, Hubert de Burgh was the other person who must have played the key part in these decisions. I think his approach was purely practical, whereas Langton's approach was ideological. But Henry III often did beat his breast and say, you know, I believe in the charter and I've sworn to these things and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, he never had the sufficient drive and grip to try and enforce it properly.
David, can you in 2 minutes tell us about finding the 1300 copy?
Yeah, no, very, very quickly. So that is here. Where is it? There it is. So I was just looking through all the Harvard Law School material. It doesn't look terribly exciting, does it? I was looking at these statute books, these sorts of things, just to look at all the copies made. And Harvard Law School has this amazing collection of statute books, which have these copies of law and legislation and copies of Magna Carta, and they've digitized them all. Actually, this isn't a Harvard Law School one, but Harvard Law School ones look like this. So you sort of just click through, and these wonderful digitized images until you come to this one, and you think, oh my God. Well, sorry, why isn't this going on? Oh, well, maybe I can't show it to you. Seems to have died a death. Anyway, I was sort of clicking on, and you saw momentarily what I saw, and which is here. Where's it go? Anyway, so there we go. I saw that. And I thought, oh my God, well, that's not one of these law books at all. It looks like an original Magna Carta of 1300, having sort of glanced through it. And so then I thought, well, I wonder what they think it is. And so if you go on to the next one, they hadn't properly looked at it, not yet described. This is from the catalogue, not a statute book, that's true. Single sheet Magna Carta. Hollis, which is their full catalogue, dates it to 1327, and then they said, oh, we've had a look, but it looks like 1298, which is completely wrong. It's 1300, and there's no awareness there that it was actually the original. And then if you trace back, you discover they bought it in 1946 for peanuts. It must now be worth millions and millions of dollars at a London auction from Air Vice Marshal Maynard. And of course, you need then to, just quickly going on, obviously first impressions can be misleading. So I didn't want to end up like Hugh Trevor Roper, Lord Dacre, who authenticated the Hitler diaries and then discovered he looking very. I didn't want to. He's got white hair too, hasn't he? So I didn't want to end up like that. So I called in my friend and colleague Nick Vincent, and together we investigated it. And I investigated the text and the handwriting, and it's absolutely compatible with the only other 6 originals known of this. And Nick amazingly investigated the provenance and was able to show that it was probably that Maynard would descended from the Clarksons, who was an abolitionist and lived near Appleby in Westmoreland, and probably this is the Appleby original known to have existed in the 18th century. And of course, he was an abolitionist, and abolitionists, he's even got a thing in Westminster Abbey, Thomas Clarkson. Of course, they called in aid Magna Carta. There's Charles James Fox holding Magna Carta for the abolition of slavery. And so probably what happened was that Maynard, near Appleby, went into the Appleby town hall, said, oh, can I have the Appleby Magna Carta? Again, this would never happen now, would it, in the National Archives or any archives? Said, could I have the Appleby Magna Carta? And he may just have taken it or paid for it, and then it descends to Air Vice Marshal Maynard, by which time nobody knows what it is, and everyone just thinks it's a later copy. And that's why Harvard Law School is able to get it for peanuts. Sorry, in very brief, that is the story.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you.